Well, I think perhaps we will begin, and then maybe just coming a bit later. But I think we will begin. I'm Helen Hayes. I'm chairing today's session. Right, I think I was very to talk to us. I'm extremely pleased to introduce Charlene Swartz, Dr. Charlene Swartz from the University of Cape Town. I've known Charlene for a number of years now, and I'm delighted when I heard she's going to be in the meeting give us an opportunity to talk about her work. Charlene's background is very interesting. She grew up in South Africa, I'm South African, and her first degree was in fact in the sciences. After the degree in science, she joined an NGO which was dedicated to work on anti-racism and HIV education. And she worked there for 12 years. And then she decided she wanted to return to a bit more exact mental activity. So she applied for this program and ended up here. So she came to the S group from here, a master's student in 2002 to 3. Which stimulated and revived her interest in research in the academy. And she ended up went off to the other Cambridge in England with her real with her PhD in the start of education at Cambridge University in England. And it's around that time, I think, that I first met her. But particularly, I met her because we have a program in the Association for Moral Education, which is an international organisation concerned with moral education. We have a dissertation report where a group decides on the best dissertations to be submitted to us. And in 2007, was it?
Yes, 8.
Certainly, Charlene won the best dissertation award. It was quite clear from the very beginning reading the dissertation was going to be good. So, and subsequently, she also contributed a special issue around South African issues of moral education, the Journal of Moral Education, and that also won the prize for the best set of papers that year. So she's still winning prizes. She's also written 5 books, I think, and one of which we're going to talk about. So we were absolutely delighted that she's able to come. She's now working for Cape Town University and the Human
Sciences
Research Council.
Yeah.
I think she might be that. So thank you for coming. Done.
Thank you, Helen. And thank you very much for coming to listen. I'd like to talk about some new work, some old work and some new work, and trying to make the connections between the two. So Inequality is the book from my dissertation. I'm 5 years out of my PhD. It came out in 2009, so it's 3 years old. But I've only just begun to be finished with mining the implications of the book. So I want to start by reading just a few paragraphs at the end, and then I want to talk about what I've got up on the PowerPoint. And then I'll tell you a little bit about the study itself. But it's really the issues around restitution that I would like to get some feedback, and it's brand new work, and so in a sense I'm very keen to have some response. So here I go. After the first few weeks in the field, I asked myself, what world was this that I was experiencing? It was a world in which a young woman comes to a school the day after her brother is shot in front of her. A baby is found dead in a drain. A woman is raped and killed in a field. A grade 8 student forces his penis into another boy's mouth at school to teach him a lesson. A teacher is threatened at school with a knife. It was a world of violence and revenge, shootings and stabbings, where young men and women beat their romantic partners and drink alcohol and smoke drugs out of boredom and then addiction. It was a place where 14-year-old boys robbed girls of sweets at knife point, where teachers came to school drunk, smoked dacha or marijuana with students in the toilets, and solicit sex from female students. At the same time, it was also a world in which youth write songs extolling people to wake up and make a plan to escape poverty, where young people help serve food to those who have lost their homes in a shack fire, and where teenagers display a parental concern for younger siblings and neighborhood children alike. It was a world where mothers make enormous sacrifices for their children and teachers spend afternoons helping young people to come to terms with their HIV infection, drug addiction, and pain at having an absent father just before a circumcision or uwaluko ceremony. It was a world where a young man refuses to defend himself from an abusive mother because she is his mother, where a son lies to protect his mother's reputation, and where a skuli, or a gangster, wheels a friend who has been stabbed to hospital in a supermarket trolley because no one would help him. It is a place where a young man stands up to another wielding a panga, or an axe, in an attempt to make peace. Another goes to live 40 kilometers away in order to escape gang affiliation, where young people demonstrate tenacity and courage in trying to reform their behavior, and where they regard being good as a way to escape poverty and help their suffering mothers and siblings. This world of Ikasi youth was certainly not one I had expected, nor was I expecting the kind of deep access that I was given. I have worked with young people for over 25 years in the suburbs and townships of South Africa, but I've never spent such a sustained amount of time with any one group of youth. I do believe I've experienced a world to which few adults have access, and certainly one seldom encountered by academics. Is this world negative or positive? The answer, of course, is multifaceted. South African township youth inhabit a world fraught with horror, violence, crime, and substance abuse, but they also have remarkable moral capital, which has been ignored by the official quest for moral regeneration. Are these good kids or bad kids? This answer, too, is complex. They are mostly good kids living in a bad world, knowing right but going wrong, neglected and living non-reflective lives. They do bad things which, given the availability and pervasiveness of alcohol and drugs, become entrenched. Tupac Shakur, in one of his songs about life in an American ghetto, sums up these young people's life profoundly when he writes, "No one knows my struggle, they only see the trouble." In a similar manner, this moral ecology of South Africa's township youth needs to form the focus of educational attention if educators and policymakers are to see beyond the trouble and apply innovative interventions. This book has aimed to make that struggle clear. So my study followed 37 young people around for almost 2 years. I spent quite a bit of time just hanging out, and I'll tell you a little bit about it in a little bit more detail. But what I wanted to start speaking about today is a quote from Nelson Mandela that says, "Poverty and the breakdown of family life have secondary effects. Children wander the streets of the townships because they've got no schools to go to, no money to enable them to go to school, or no parents at home to see that they go to school. This leads to a breakdown in moral standards, to an alarming rise in illegitimacy, and to growing violence, which erupts not only politically, but everywhere." The interesting thing about that quote that Nelson Mandela wrote is he was talking about the 1960s South Africa. When I read it now in 2012, the question, of course, becomes what's different, what's changed in South Africa. So, what's happened since democracy? Well, firstly, democracy. We've got democracy. Education is equal. Young people can go to a school of their choice. They can't because the good schools are far away from them, but they have a choice. We have freedom, we have equality, we have economic growth. We had the World Cup. We had gold medals and at the London Olympics. So a lot of things have happened. But also we've had a Truth Commission that never transferred ownership of resources. There wasn't a mass transference of wealth. There's enormous and growing inequality in South Africa. I've got some figures to show you. There's a growing rage amongst the lumpen proletariat. Burning schools, libraries, and violent wage strikes and labor protests have been in the news quite recently. There's been increasing corruption. It's our turn to eat is a common refrain in South Africa. You might have seen some of the pictures of the Marikana mine massacre just recently, where 34 people were shot by the police protesting against the low wages. Just a few days ago, a protest in Cape Town, where people take to the streets, burn schools and libraries because of the inequality in education, in economics, because of the poverty in my country. One young person took a picture on her way to school, and the picture is really about showing some of the shacks that she rides past and where she lives. And her comment is, this is a bad influence. People are living in this bad condition like ants. I took this picture from the train because sometimes these shacks are burning here and we are getting wet because the water comes through the zinc. And then a few minutes later on, she takes this picture and she says, this is a beautiful place. I think it's a good influence. I wish I could stay in this beautiful houses. It's on the way to Mandalay. I wish the people are living in bad conditions can live in these houses. So what is the official story around inequality in South Africa? These figures aren't important. It's the shape of the distribution. It's this champagne glass of inequality. Not unusual for many countries, but in South Africa, amongst the highest in the world. So 16% own or earn 72% of the income. And in this column here, the interesting thing is that nothing much has changed, except maybe a growth in how much of the income people earn. And the 2011 census came out last Monday, and it's gone up just a few more points, if I were to add that column. So the inequality in South Africa is huge. What is 69,000 Rand per year? It's now gone up to about 109,000 Rand, which is about $13,000 an annum. And it's what a starting high school teacher would make. So just to put it into perspective. So if you're a starting high school teacher, you're in the top 20% of income earners in South Africa, just to put it into context. Poverty by race and gender, just a very clear picture. Of all those who live below the poverty line of 515 Rand per month, who are disproportionately affected? Black women, black men, colored women, colored men, Asian or Indian women, men, and then white men and women almost naught. One of my students in my class a couple of weeks ago put up his hand and said, so, since democracy, the overarching achievement of government has been to take white poverty from 0.1% and turn it into 0%. It was a cynical comment, but well made. And here's another interesting chart that shows the Gini coefficient, the measurement of inequality in a country, from 0.67 in 93, so just the year before democracy, to 0.7 in 2008, and we're still at about 0.7 in 2012. But here's an interesting thing. So these population groups or race groups are historical division from the apartheid years, and really what's going on in each group is just an increasing level of inequality as you go down. And you can see that who is becoming more unequal, kind of the Indian and Asian population, but 20% amongst white South Africans, 12% amongst black South Africans, 25% amongst Indian South Africans. So things are changing if you look at the overall picture in South Africa, but who are being affected? Well, a group of people are becoming enriched through affirmative action policies, etc. So my study, which ran in 2004, 2005, 2006, and then I wrote it up after that, followed these young people. What were some of the biggest issues that I found? Well, an issue about partial parenting. 63% of young people don't live with a father figure in the home. Partial schooling, coming in and out of the schooling system, either because they're dropping out to go and, because the problems at home or interpersonal problems. But in historical blindness around race, a normalization of violence, debilitating substance use, but huge aspirations, wanting to be amazing things in the future. My study, I think, as I said, an ethnographic study, lots of participant observation. I'm still in touch with about 15 of the 37 young people. It's not a field that you can easily leave. And also because I'm a youth worker by training, I suppose I didn't really want to. But those young people have become key informants for other studies. They've become transcribers for me. I've got some of my friends to help put them through university, find a first job. And so I've stayed in touch with those young people. But before you think I'm a saint, I haven't done it with any of my other studies since then because it's just too much of a commitment. So be careful what you do in your doctoral study because it will stay with you. Lots of interaction, young people between 14 and 20, mostly in the 9th grade. And so you'll notice that there's a disparity in age because young people are in and out of the schooling system. In the townships of Cape Town, and Ikasi is just a colloquial term for township. It would be the equivalent of favela or barrio or banlieue or maybe council estate in the UK. But yeah. Interviews, photo voice, they took photographs for me, a questionnaire, mind maps, lots of interaction in the study, but also just a lot of hanging out. A couple of the questions that I asked was, who is responsible if you don't achieve your goals in life? And overwhelmingly, these young people showed this issue, well, displayed the whole theme of meritocracy. I am responsible, I will get ahead if only I work really hard. There's a little bit of a difference between young men and young women. So young men, only me, young women, something or something else is responsible too. When I asked for them to talk about poverty, how does it affect you? Andiswa, a young woman, says, sure, very much. It's actually putting an end stop to most of the things that I want to do because, the township school was not my dream school. I wanted to go to a suburb school. Tando, no, I've learned to live with it. I've learned to accept it in different ways. Like I know how to help myself, but in a positive way. Not in a bad way, like robbing and doing drugs and going to break in people's houses and all those things. I just forget about being poor because at the time it will lower my self-esteem. It will make me, sadness and, So I just keep myself listening to music and dancing just to forget about all those things. When I ask young people about apartheid, and here the caveat, for the first year and a half, nobody would talk to me about apartheid. I'm a white South African, a beneficiary of injustice. And so nobody spoke to me because they didn't want to offend me, because we were actually having quite a good time. We were hanging out, we were walking up the mountain, we were going to the beach, we were sitting in classes, we were doing all sorts of really nice things, and they didn't want to offend me. But after a year and a half, many of them came to me and said, can we just talk frankly now? So I said, yeah, sure. After a year and a half, of course you can. So some of the conversations started by saying, well, apartheid hasn't affected my life. I live in a freedom world now. I will have a house like yours if I work hard. Young people came to my home. They saw where I lived in the suburbs. That was the return for me going to see their houses and where they lived in the shacks in which they lived. Lekolo, when I was there was no apartheid. When I was born, there was no apartheid. Moza, young woman, it affected our grannies because they are all domestic workers and we don't live in the suburbs. And colored people's dogs chase us. So a young black woman. Amanda, it affects me because it affected my parents who couldn't be what they wanted to be. Depua, there's no apartheid, it doesn't affect me. So a range of opinions, but mainly around let's forget the past, let's move on to the future. And I had a chat with somebody yesterday who said that she's finding almost the same thing in Guatemala in her study. When I asked young people to do they took a little survey, half of them said that apartheid was not an influence in their life at all. And there's no 5 here. And so very few of them said it was a very strong influence at all. So just not an incredible understanding of how apartheid 20 years ago may have affected their lives today. So some young people did make the connections, and here I've got a few little dialogues that I think help to illustrate that. And this is not my finest example of interviewing technique. I was frustrated and I think I harassed young Batiswa. So my mother had no money to buy and to live in another house. She's not working because she didn't get a job. So I say, why do you live in a shack and I live in a house, Batiswa? Batiswa, because you have money, because my mother is not working. Charlene, you think it's got nothing to do with apartheid that I have money and you don't? Yes, apartheid, because for the black people it's not easy to find a job. So see the instrumental associations. White people, it's easy to find a job because other whites learn, so black people not learn. Because in long ago, the black people is not getting a better education, so white people have a better education. And the black people, their parents have no money to go to school. Just a comment about the language. Young people spoke to me in English in interviews, and so most of them's first language would be isiXhosa, My isiXhosa was conversational but not good enough to do interviews in, but I did transcribe verbatim. So it's not an indication of anything except language proficiency. And if you'd heard my Xhosa, it would be much worse than these young people's English. Mandisa, making the connections. If I'm starving and there's no food, there's nothing I can do. I go to sleep. Education is the one thing that is going to help me to do what I want to do, because I want to learn and get, when I finish learning, and get a better job, and I want to do for my mother. I want to be an accountant. And if somebody offers you a job as a domestic worker, Mandisa, I will take it. You will, even though you're only 19 years old? I will take it because my mother, where she lives, I don't like that house. I want to help her. It's not right, that house. It's too small because it's only 2 rooms. And then this young man, probably the most startling example of kind of connecting the dots when it comes to apartheid, poverty, and inequality. I blame no one because I am myself. No one pushes me to do anything. If I say no, I say no. No, like I blame no one. Not my friends, Charlene, not them, because they didn't force me to smoke dacha, marijuana. You know, Charlene, when I don't want to do something, I don't want to. And not Ikasi, it doesn't push you, living in Ikasi. Yeah, Charlene, I can say that, because if I was not living there, like maybe I was behaving in another place, like being another person, maybe I was not behaving like I am now. And apartheid, how has that affected you? A long pause. Like Charlene, it has affected my parents, and when it affects my parents, it affects me, you know, because if apartheid didn't affect them, then maybe we would be staying in the suburbs, you know, Charlene. Like me, I wouldn't get corrupt, like I will still be at school. Me. So why, Vuma? Why wouldn't you be corrupt if there was no apartheid? Because you said it's only you. You make the decisions. Yeah, Charlene, at the same time, like where I stay in the township, you know, Charlene, you see everything there, you know. So maybe if my parents are staying in the suburbs, I wouldn't know about those things. And I didn't see so many people smoking ganja, you know. So maybe my parents will give me everything and make sure I go to school, and then I have the things that I want to get, you know. But now. And then the last comment from Potsolitso, that just kind of gives you an idea of the interaction and the way these young people are interacting with what was going on in South Africa. She says, I think education should be free. Some young people want to be good people, but they don't have money to go to university, so they can study and then become good people when they've got their own jobs. So they don't have money, so they end up staying in the streets doing all those, you know, wrong things. So why am I showing you some of this data? Because I really do want to talk about the effects of poverty and inequality on young people. Now, Paul Farmer talks about structural violence, and he says that it's the institutionalizing of social processes that cause suffering through unequal access to resources like rights and security, capital and bodily and mental integrity, based on markers of difference. So because you're young and black, you're not going to be able to access the rights and resources of a citizen. It's about systematic exclusion from citizenship, from the rights and responsibility, what I've called the old scars. But inequality and limited redress from the TRC and from our almost 20 years since democracy has resulted in poor education. So even though you can go to a different school, you're prevented by geography, by finances, and then once you get to a wealthy school or a suburban school, you can't cope because your reading levels are really low. These are things that apply internationally, and we know them. But we've got high unemployment, we've got insufficient health care, insecurity, and no property ownership rights for many South Africans. And this dearth of capitals, I'm using Bourdieu's language now, accumulates over generations. And then Bourdieu speaks about the emotional consequences of poverty, a loss of dignity and autonomy, purpose and security, a coherent life structure, and feelings of hopelessness. There's a progenetic action of inequality, and what do I mean by this? Helen said that I started my academic career doing a science degree, so I did zoology. So this is a picture of a trematode worm, a parasitic worm, what they call a progenetic worm in the literature. And what happens is that these worms will infest a host and then die. And then 2 or 3 or 4 or 5 years later, the eggs living within the worm will still hatch and be viable. So it's the means of reproduction is progenetic. So even though the animal or the worm has died, the eggs remain viable. And that for me is a really good illustration of what's happened in South Africa. So we've come to an end of apartheid, legislated inequality and oppression and injustice. But the eggs are still hatching, and new eggs are hatching as the years go by, and there is no redress in a way that returns some of the dignity and humanity to South Africans, and especially young people. So in a recent paper that was published in Comparative Education in February of this year, it's called Ikasi Style and the Quiet Violence of Dreams. I want to just read this piece to you because it sums it up really well. Well, sorry, I'm not allowed to say that. Despite the repeal of apartheid laws, poverty and inequality persist in part because of the internalization of inequalities, which still structure social behaviors. This perception of the internal coherence of differential privilege produced by the exclusive experience of a world marked in this way is reproduced throughout South Africa across all lines of race, class, and gender. In the context of such structural and symbolic violence, South Africans' assumption of coherence within social, political, and economic systems in effect enables the perpetuation of inequality. So for me, a really important piece is not just that young people have a strong sense of meritocracy, but they've also internalized some of the oppression, and so it becomes a form of symbolic violence where they see a coherence in always being at the end of the spectrum, the last in the queue. But that is slowly changing in South Africa. So Wendy Brown, who you'll know, speaks about mainly about wounded attachments when it comes to gender relationships and equality. I've taken that term, wounded attachments, to speak about how it is that young people in South Africa are experiencing a wounded nation and a wounded attachment. Not that they have no agency, but that the agency is often wounded. So citizenship includes both rights and access, and Ikasi style is what I suppose is just another term for antisocial behavior. Some of the things that I've read about, the violence and the crime and the housebreaking and the substance abuse, that young people see as a new way of belonging. So I can belong to this group of young people in a township. I can be part of one of the gents, one of the men, or one of the chickens. But also work entitlements. There are sometimes jobs available, but I don't want to do that job. I want to do an office job. I want to be a lawyer. I want to have a clean job, not a dirty job. Don't want to do a construction job or a domestic laboring job. I want a better kind of job because democracy has made it possible for me to have that job. And then the service protests. One of the ironies around the Marikana mine protest is that workers were protesting that they were only earning 10,000 Rand a month, which puts them in the top 20 percentile of the scale. Now, the irony about that, of course, is that I'm sure that they don't see 10,000 Rand a month. One of the problems is that they've got households of maybe 8 to 10 people, and so whatever money they get back after tax is spread so thinly, whereas in a middle-class house, a 10,000 Rand salary is only for you, in many cases. And so they wanted 12,500, which will put them above, what many people in the top quintile earns. So they're dreams of aspiration and access, but sometimes these dreams are what I've called the quiet violence. If you're always aspiring and never getting to it, what happens? So maybe when you're 15, you aspire and you're hopeful and you say apartheid hasn't done anything to affect me. But when you're 27 and you're sitting on the same street corner without a job, without money, without means to marry, form a family, or whatever it is, what happens then? So young people through Ikasi style say, I'm of the township and I embrace this hurt or wounded status quo, but then they also want to heal themselves through hope and dreams. I want something better. They are not wounded citizens, but they have wounded attachments with injured, so they have injured attachments. But Wendy Brown is not the only theorist to speak about this wounded nation of South Africa. Mampela Rampela, who wrote the book Steering by the Stars and who was also the Vice-Chancellor of the University of Cape Town and director at the World Bank, and is now the chairman of Goldfields, one of our biggest gold mining houses, and was also the mother of Steve Biko's, one of Steve Biko's children. So a huge figure in South Africa and hugely respected with quite a variegated history. She speaks about this persistent wound of racism, a wounded people, she says we are, in denial about our wounds. That we've experienced a scarring of the black psyche, drawing on Frantz Fanon, the effects of which are a socially induced inferiority complex, self-hatred, low self-esteem, jealousy of those seem to be progressing, both black and white, suppressed aggression and anxiety. And then Archbishop Emeritus of Cape Town, Desmond Tutu, says, at the end of the Truth and Reconciliation Commission report in 1998, he said that the TRC was meant to unleash a social dynamic. Only if this emerging truth unleashes a social dynamic that includes redressing the suffering of victims will it have met the ideal of restorative justice. Father Desmond, as he's known in South Africa, is saddened by what's happened in our country in the last 20 years because while there have been many things that have been exciting, it hasn't trickled down to the poorest, to the 80% of the country. The top 20% seem to be doing okay. So how do we address this woundedness? And that's the old work. That's kind of how I've come to this point. And for me, it's about re-looking at the notion of restitution and broadening it so that it doesn't just become affiliated or equivalent to affirmative action or to land redistribution. That it becomes a wider concept that we can look at in social contexts, or in individual, civic, communal, and structural contexts. And so what I've done is I've had a look at the legal and historical uses of the term. I've looked at some of the recent interdisciplinary alternatives, and my proposal for a future study that I'm in the middle of finding funding for is the restitution of personhood. What is it in the South African wounded psyche that needs to be restored, changed, healed, I suppose, as the missing piece in the transformation puzzle? So often we speak about justice, transformation, peace process, and reconciliation. And we've got some of all of those in South Africa. The TRC has been a peace process, transformation in universities, in affirmative action, reconciliation, healing of memories, workshops and discussion groups, sometimes justice through the courts, but not always. But what's missing? And for me, I would say that the missing piece is this notion of restitution. So why restitution? To address woundedness, Rampele, with healing, to answer this call for a social dynamic, to showcase theorized models for just action. Not just to talk about it, but to say, so what should we do about it? To address injustice, poverty, and inequality systematically and at multiple levels. To align peace processes like the TRC with reconciliation, justice, and transformation. And so, just very briefly, because a lot of this, I think you just need to kind of get a little bit of the sense of where it's come from. In historical and legal context, restitution has often been about to rectify unjust enrichment, to restore to a prior state, to the way it was before the injustice occurred. It's about compensation for the wrong, but also gain stripping, taking back what you gained illegitimately. It's about reparations and apologies, but reparations and apologies alone are not restitution. It's a bigger concept. It can include psychological harm. So young people who've been victims of child pornography are now instituting court cases where they're asking for restitution to be made. So not just socio-politically, but also in cases of criminal and civic offences. The idea is to punish the offender and to compensate the victim. Sometimes there's a restorative justice element to rehabilitate the offender, but often at the individual and state level. So there's individual law, but also International Law Commission has got statutes for restitution. And Martha Minnow writes about it, Elazar Barkin writes about it. And so restitution is not a new concept. But I think what might be new is to say not just a structural political issue or a criminal issue, but in a context like South Africa, how can we put together a project or a program on restitution? And a few contemporary scholars are dealing with issues of restitution. So Eglash, not that contemporary, he's a little bit, so from the 50s, speaks about voluntary rather than legislative restitution, creative, not just punitive. And I think that's a good starting block, certainly for me. Elazar Barkan at Columbia speaks about an international morality in which restitution is an important part. A continuum of community responsibility across generations, and quite a few people speak about that. Young, Calder, McIntyre, and Mahmoud Mamdani, also at Columbia. And then Todd Calder speaks about not just backward-looking, so not just punitive, but forward-looking. So kind of a paying it forward issue that's been popularized in the recent past. And then Braithwaite, of course, you'll know, who speaks about restorative justice, restoring victors, offenders, communities, and nations, but not putting all the onus on the victims to forgive, because that's often been done to the detriment of this wounded nation. And Booth says, we are our past as well as our future. So how do we redefine restitution? From restoring things to how they were before the injustice was perpetrated, which we can't do clearly in a context like South Africa, to a very simple definition, the act of paying back for wrongs previously committed and the act of making right symbolically or materially. It includes philosophical, emotional, theological, psychological, physical, and economic elements. And it introduces the notion of personhood. I'm getting a little bit philosophical here. What are the elements of this personhood that we need to restore, that needs to be restituted? What are the domains of agency in this restitution of personhood? And what are the positionalities of actors in the restitution of personhood? Now, I've got just a few more slides, but I realize that actually what it is it's the book at the end of the study. But what I've got now is I've got the ideas of what it could be. And so I want to talk about it a little bit because I'm certainly quite excited about it. It's taken me about a year and a bit to come to these three ideas because it was just getting far too nebulous. What do I mean when I talk about restitution? But I realized that every one of them could be a chapter or a paper or half a book or something. So just hang on with me for a few more minutes. So what I mean by the positionality of actors, I think most of us are familiar with the notion that we often talk about when an injustice has occurred, a victim and a perpetrator. And we also, perhaps more sophisticatedly, speak about a bystander behavior. So you're familiar with that. In the South African context, I'd like to suggest that it becomes a lot more complicated. And in fact, in many cases, it's a lot more complicated. And I'm playing around with these 5 terms. And what do I mean by them? Well, here's, let me just read through some of these issues. If you're an architect of injustice on the wrong side of the injustice, so for example, in South Africa, Verwoerd was the education minister. He would have been an architect of the injustice of education for servitude. Flock, minister of police, detention without trial. So an architect would be different to an implementer. An implementer might have been the foot soldier, the police or security policeman who implemented these laws that came down, a security policeman, but also people who took advantage of cheap labor, for example, exploiting cheap labor. What I'd also like to suggest, though, is that you can be an architect of both injustice and justice. So who would have been the architect of resistance to injustice? Well, it would have been Mandela and Ronnie Kastor's and Walter Sisulu and, our current president sometimes. What about an implementer, resistance to injustice? Well, the Mkhonto Wesizwe foot soldier, mass action participant, civic committees who resisted apartheid. Then there are those who have been dishonored by apartheid. Now, who are those? Those are people for whom the systems and the structures excluded them. They became this wounded nation. But can we say that there are people who were perpetrating the injustice who were also dishonored? So an apartheid informer, perhaps, a person who got a job reserved for them, were they not dishonored by the system of apartheid? That's an argument. And then, of course, the beneficiary, perhaps a clearer category. White people in general, people who were the leaders of the Bantustan, kind of the segregated places around South Africa, But there were also beneficiaries of resistance to apartheid. People who grew up with black consciousness as an ideology, they were beneficiaries of resistance. And then finally, this inheritor. The group of kids that I speak about is say, well, I was born after 1990, apartheid was almost dead, and so what have I inherited? Well, if you're a white South African, you've inherited amazing benefit. A great educational system, a great house, a great opportunity. Even though we have affirmative action, no white young men are without jobs in South Africa. If they want to work, there's work for them. But young black men and young black women are without work, even if they wanted to work. Our unemployment rate for young people is 50% at the moment, which is huge, but it's the same as Greece. I didn't realize that. It's the same as Greece's. For young people, 15 to 24. And so can you also be an inheritor of dishonor? Of course you can. Impoverishment, poor quality education. And so that's really what these positionalities of actors is all about, and that's just what I've spoken through. Miller says, David Miller, in his Principles of Social Justice that people use a lot, says that we need to have opportunities, rights, and resources. And that, for me, is why the next piece of what are the elements of personhood. And here I haven't done a lot of work, but I have a feeling that these 6 elements cover it. When we say we want to restore personhood, what is it? Is it people's dignity? Sure, I think that's important. Is it memory of the past? Absolutely. One of the biggest issues in South Africa is people forgetting what it was like under apartheid. So my class of 400 students, they're 20 years old. I said, who of you knows about the Verwoerd Education Act of 1953? Not a single person. One young guy who's a senior mature student who was 42, he said, no, I know. But he wasn't eloquent enough to tell the rest of the class, but he came and spoke to me afterwards. The memory of both young black South Africans and young white South Africans is almost erased. It could have been, I asked somebody how old Steve Biko might have been. Well, he would have been 65 in September. One young black man put up his hand and said 200. Same as Marx. Well, you know, the sense of history and discontinuity with the past is just phenomenal. So we need to restore memory in ourselves if we're going to restore our personhood. Of course, equality, but not just equality in the statute books, but lived equality. Means relates back to David Miller's issue of opportunity. Means and opportunity are resources and access to resources and citizenship. Not just the rights, but the access to rights. So those are the 6 elements of personhood that I think is what we're aiming at in a project of restitution. I won't go through that. And then the last piece for me is in what domains do we exercise this agency? And for me, I think we focus in South Africa on the structural, housing subsidies, youth unemployment subsidies, black economic empowerment or affirmative action, health insurance, solidarity tax in Germany that's been going for almost 20 years. The reunification tax is a restitution tax. There's a law of historical memory in Spain. And these are all great domains of agency, but what else do we need? And certainly at a civic level in South Africa, commemorating the Land Act. Do we understand what happened when land was taken away from people in 1913 through an act of parliament? What about community partnerships? What about physically reintegrating racially divided churches? It's not uncommon in South Africa for there to be a black Anglican church and a white Anglican church with a road in between them. What about teaching about black consciousness? Of course, corporate social responsibility, museums, centers of remembrance. But what about at individual levels? Commemorating public holidays. We've just had a human rights, National Heritage Day, and it's become National Barbecue Day, National Braai Day. That's not the way to restore personhood. We need to remember some of the incidents that happened that brought about the state of our country. Apologies, voluntary limitations to children's inheritance. That one's going down like a lead balloon at the moment in South Africa. Reading to children in impoverished communities, learning an indigenous language, cross-racial adoption, contested. So different domains of agency. And that for me is where the study is going, is that what I'd like to do is I'd like to look at these 3 elements, the positionalities of actors, the domains of agency and the elements of personhood, and to look at it in a number of countries. So to look at social attitudes towards restitution, the theories, policies and legislation, and then models and social movements of restitution. And there are a lot, but to bring them together into those three categories. 10 countries: Canada and the US, Liberia, Rwanda, South Africa, Chile, China, Australia, Germany, and Bosnia. Why? Well, there's quite an extensive rationale for them, partly where there's partners, but partly because of the issues. Not all of them are socio-political. Some of them are things like child pornography or forced adoption in Australia or whatnot. And I think what I'm trying to do is to say that when we speak about young people, the context of young people, the woundedness of a post-conflict context, we need to bring issues of justice, peace, transformation together, and that I think that a restitution of personhood deals with it. So, thank you.
Well, discussion, comments, questions?
Apple juice. Yeah, every now and again I'm saying homeland. Does anybody know what a homeland is? So, you know, during the apartheid years, what happened to the government, with the government, is that they said, well, we don't have black people staying in our country. We're putting them into reserves and they'll have their own government. I mean, that was one way of saying, well, you know, this is a legitimate way of dealing with people. Okay, so questions. Sarah.
Thanks, Shannon. That was so interesting, and obviously these are the pieces of the big study that you're about to do. One of the questions I had, I was surprised in the chart that you presented at the end that what goes on within classrooms didn't appear at all. And I wondered whether you could talk a little bit about not only the structural elements of this restitution, but at the individual and civic level, what do the relationships
Yeah.
Yeah.
So I think one of the first and the most, the biggest problem is the fact that we don't have really well integrated schools in South Africa. So 80% of South African kids are in all black schools in poor township communities. Kids who have moved to the former suburban schools, what happens is that then there's white flight, and I think it's a phenomenon you're probably familiar with, you know, here. So that then white young people who can afford it go to private schools. And so what you end up with in the suburban schools is young people who don't live in the community who come in, and then it's black kids and coloured kids in a suburban school. Now, not all over the place, but that's certainly a big issue. So when you talk about reconciliation and you want to talk about you know, you do a facing history or facing the past curriculum, you don't often have an audience where there's all of those positionalities in the classroom, and so that becomes difficult. And we do. I think there's a lot of work being done on things like the history curriculum and programs like Facing History and whatnot. But yeah, I mean, I do want to look at what else could happen in a school. Nadine Dolby's book, Constructing Race, written in 2001 in a school in Durban. She's from CUNY, but she came to South Africa for a couple of years. What she found was that young people didn't really want to talk about it, and they constructed race not as separateness but as taste. So we don't like each other's music, that's why we don't hang out together. And so even these kids in suburban schools were constructing race in a way which, in a sense, just echoes Bourdieu's habitus. You know, it was a great example of Bourdieu's theory. Some more, Sarah? I mean, are you?
I guess then whether there are other kinds of spaces in which people can come together. And I see the kind of reintegrating racially divided churches, or and this has been one of my questions related to immigration in this country also, of what are the spaces in which new immigrants and longtime residents of a place actually come together, and is that the workplace? I mean, obviously with 50% youth unemployment, there are many people who are not in a work but
Yeah.
what are those spaces where you can have people coming together to interact in such a way
Yeah.
that you develop relationships, develop some of the language around dignity, equality,
Yeah.
and other elements of person.
And sport, I mean, I think sport in South Africa is huge, and there's a huge government drive at developing social cohesion through sport. But again, it depends on sport for which you don't need equipment, right? Because otherwise you just can't participate if you're an impoverished kid from a township. I thought that the great hope was going to be through the churches, because 80% of South Africans profess to be Christians and will find themselves in a service on a Sunday. But I also chair an NGO called the Restitution Foundation. We were working through faith-based communities. And there's just not a desire to give up privilege. Or what you'll do is you'll have a partnering, but then the white church just sets the agenda, takes over, runs the program. And so black churches say, no, I don't want to be part of that, because it's just a perpetuation of what has gone before. So I don't know. And that's a really good question, is what are the spaces? We don't have community spaces, right? Because our housing is so separate. And so a lot of people are thinking through, what does it mean to integrate a community, and how do you do it without people then exiting? I don't know.
I was curious about sort of your initial work with the communities, like how did sort of like your initial contact with them go? How did they welcome you in and and as an outsider gain that sort of trust?
Yeah. So I based myself at a school, and I was there every day, and I followed one class. So there were 3 grade 9 classes. I attached myself to one of them, and I did grade 9 biology, grade 9 English, grade 9 Xhosa. I just followed them around. And I was a curiosity, of course. But after a couple of weeks, the kids came to talk to me, and they came to joke with me, and they came to tell me long stories. So one guy told me about how he had 3 kids, and he sent them to creche, and I was going, wow, why you're only 17, you've got 3 kids. And then he said to me, just ripping you off a bit. And I'm like, writing in my notebook. And he goes, yeah, I got you. So I think it was just, I kind of toughed it out. I just sat there for months and months. But quite quickly, 4 or 5 young people came and said, listen, we feel sorry for you. Let's just teach you a little bit of Xhosa. Let's teach you how to conduct yourself. Let's make sure that you don't get your cell phone swiped. Let's tell you who the gangsters are at school. Let's tell you who the mothers and the safe places are in the community. And let's show you around. And so that was really the trust building stuff. I kept saying, so what do you want from me? They said, no, we just are so bored. We come to school, and we got to do it afterwards. So you're a welcome diversion in our community. And those are some of the kids that I'm still really invested in and in touch with. But it's just a long process of talking and staying. And I think 2 years of ethnography is very helpful, because you're just always there.
But continue from here, we were saying after, like, they start to really open up, like, what they were saying about apartheid after 1.5 years. Like, what did you do this? Because it's 2 years, but then they really opened up after 1.5 years, as I understood.
Yeah, I mean, I think it was, I'm generalizing. So one of the things that Mampele Rampele did is she took kids on adventure outreach activities. So they went canoeing and mountain climbing and rock climbing and whatever. And I thought to myself, well, I'm getting huge amounts from these kids. I mean, this is a career-building piece of research, right? And so I got people to sponsor those kind of activities. I took them away in groups of 12. We went rock climbing and abseiling and all sorts of things. And that was just phenomenal, because it kind of blew their minds from a new experience point of view. And they said, so what do you want? I said, well, I just want to talk, and I want you to be free. And let me tell you about the research process, that the stuff that you're going to tell me, I'm going to write down, and I'm going to look at, I'm going to analyze, interpret, but it'll be confidential. And if you tell me a tall story, I'm not going to know the difference. So you need to decide how many tall stories you tell me, and how open and free and honest you are with me. And I think that worked because of the time that I had. And then there was an incident. One young man got stabbed in the head. He survived. But it was a Friday night, and I was in his township. And I got involved in taking him to the hospital, and went to go and visit him, and got, so when I got back to school on the Monday, suddenly the kids saw me in a different way. They saw that I had, I wasn't just running away when something, I suppose, dangerous was happening. And that was quite a turning point. So there was a little moment where things changed. I would much prefer that a young black South African researcher did some of that work. Two things. One, only now are young black South African researchers coming through, but also a lot of the kids say, well, we couldn't really have spoken to a black woman about the stuff we spoke to you about because of the cultural taboos. So in a sense, I become a neutral, one kid described me as a plant or a dog. You can talk to your plant, doesn't talk back. Your dog just shakes its head and is happy with what it receives. So that's quite I like being called a plant or a dog in research. Sure. Sure.
I'm really curious about when you talk about the loss of memory.
Yeah.
Because I went to school in South Africa, grew up there, and from what I learned in history, we barely talked about the apartheid era, and I was there like 5 years after apartheid ended. I remember like history from learning about like
German
trans people, and then the Anglo-Boer War, and then somehow apartheid just got lost.
Okay.
So I was really curious as to why that is, and also if there's a standard curriculum from the Department of Education or something that can help change that.
Yeah. So in 1999, which is when you're talking about, there wasn't, and that was my conversation with Sarah yesterday, there wasn't an official history curriculum because there weren't textbooks and there wasn't an agreed on version of the history of South Africa. So who writes the history textbook? It's always the Victorious, but the Victorious hadn't had time to write the textbook by 1999. Well, now it's 2012 and we're only just beginning to have new textbooks being written about South African history. And there's huge amounts of work that needs to be done. So there's a few books that have been coming out about Steve Biko, for example, from black scholars. But they're in disagreement about Steve Biko's history in South Africa because there's no definitive version of, that's a small example. And so, I think that's one of our problems, especially in our history curriculum. The other is that when you walk into a class in South Africa and you say to kids, it's June 16th tomorrow, what is it? And they go, oh, it's Youth Day. Okay, what are you going to do? No, we're going to go shop. Black Township School. What happened on June 16th? Something about Afrikaans is the comment that I've gotten a few times when I ask about Afrikaans. Well, those of you who know a little bit about South African history, June 16th was the day that police opened fire on a group of 11 to 15-year-old kids who were protesting, yes, on having to learn in Afrikaans, but at the whole system of education for servitude. And the figures, here's an example, the figures are in disagreement. Between 200 and 800 kids were killed on that day. We don't know. We don't have a record. It wasn't in the interest of the apartheid security forces to keep a record of how many kids were killed that day. And so now when we talk about June 16th, we talk about it in a way where, yes, kids died, young people died. It was the beginning of I suppose, the beginning of more of an armed struggle, an armed revolution in South Africa. But we've got still a lot of work to do in terms of history curriculum. And then there are kids saying, I don't really want to remember, I just want the future. I just want a job, I want the benefits of being a young person in post-apartheid South Africa. And that's the kind of thing that I hear from my university students the most. Let's not discuss affirmative admissions or affirmative action, because actually I want whatever I can get to get ahead. I don't want to talk about whether it's a good thing or bad thing, whether it hurts my dignity or anything. I just want to take what I can get to get ahead. And that's a problem, of course. That's why I think it's an important discussion that young people start to think about what forgetting might lose for themselves, or not remembering, refusing to remember.
I was just thinking what you were saying, and I was thinking also about that Michelle had said to you about Guatemala being a similar phenomenon.
Yeah.
And also if you think of post-war Germany. I think maybe maybe it's inevitable for a while.
Yeah.
That a country that's gone through some kind of
Trauma, yeah.
whatever kind of trauma it is, whether it was people who suffered greatly or people who didn't suffer, as for example in Germany. Maybe that generation or the immediately following generation, not the perpetrators, but the ones immediately following, just need to have that space to say, look, we can't own that history because it's unownable.
Yeah.
We haven't yet got an alternative history. It hasn't been written, and we haven't made that history. What we can do is to focus on the future and make something new. And maybe, although I entirely agree with you that actually, certainly from our perspective, forgetting the past is not only scientifically but morally wrong and psychologically wrong.
Yeah.
Maybe it has to be the next generation further on who does the going back to the history and tells the stories.
Maybe you need a disjuncture or discontinuity.
Maybe the generation who has to go through the process, and maybe actually getting this generation to remember is not perhaps, you don't want to lose the knowledge, you don't have an ignorance of who's deep in.
Yeah, you want a curriculum, right, and you want an agreed on history.
And you don't want to have ignorant about the June 16 stuff. But at the same time, maybe, it's kind of interesting about facing history. Facing history, you mentioned facing history, most people know about facing history, don't you? Facing history was founded in the mid-70s by Margaret Strong. And she, like many people of her generation, she's about my age, who were born during the war but have no memory of it. They wanted to avoid loss of memory of the Holocaust. And so they created the Facing History program to retain, not to lose the Holocaust memory, and also to use it as an educational tool.
Yeah.
And I think that's what she was doing and continued, that's what Facing History began with. And that's it. So that's somebody who was born during the period that it says Facing History.
Yeah.
So she had no memory of it. But I think that is one generation after in some way, because the generation you're talking about would have been those 15, 20 years older, as it were, people who were growing up in the 50s, 40s and 50s, not people who were growing up in the 60s and 70s.
Yeah.
Making a comparison. So maybe this, what you're asking for will be much easier in, say, 10 to 15
years' time. I agree with you when it comes to young black South Africans who are, in a sense, the inheritors of injustice and all of that. One of my problems, of course, is when I speak to white South Africans.
Well, the same generation or older?
Both. So the same generation just want to say, well, I wasn't complicit. I didn't do anything.
Like
and so, sure. Yeah. But now if I give you 5 positionalities, you go, oh, I might be here and here. I wasn't an architect. Yeah. We can all agree on that. But actually, I am a beneficiary. And then the previous generation say things like, so when we start talking about restitution, people will say, well, people must just work hard for their jobs. But they forget about the Job Reservation Act that gave them all the advantages that they have, and the Education Act and whatnot. And that for me is really important, that we don't allow the white community to forget where their benefit has come from. And I think that we're in danger of doing that, because so few people can recite the history and the litany. And I do that in almost all my writing now, is I put up a little chart that just gives you 4 or 5 pieces of legislation and when it was repealed and what it did. And it's Job Reservation Act, Group Areas Act, where you could stay. It's the who could go to university. It's just very basic pieces of legislation that an average white South African can't really remember. And that was Tutu's cry during the TRC, that all of these stories of human rights violations were coming out, but people were also just forgetting the big issues. And the other thing is corruption. So now you say to people, well, we need to start not letting your kid inherit your whole house, because that way nobody's going to ever have property in our country. And they say, but I've worked for it. You go, no, you didn't. It was reserved for you. It was given to you. And so that's an important piece that we need to talk about. And then people say, yeah, but corruption. And I've done about 4 or 5 interviews only, but they've been the most excruciating interviews that I've done in my life, because I've done 5 interviews with white South Africans who are skeptical about restitution. They're not right-wing South Africans, they're just skeptical. And so it's been 2 2-hour interviews, and those are the issues that come up. I would give half my wealth away if I knew it was going to be used properly. If it wasn't for the government corruption, I would pay extra taxes. And those are some of the things that and the reason I did the 5 skeptics was because I wanted to see what the problems are going to be in terms of program and in terms of who I'm going to do some more interviewing with.
What I want to say is I studied a bit South Africa, but for my PhD I studied Germany. For young girls, like young Muslim girls, how do they experience their education? And it's very interesting, I've done 1-year data collection in the western part of Germany and going different urban schools and talking with girls at the age of 14 to 21. Yeah. This historical trauma came in every focus group because, what I want to say is how countries are dealing with this trauma,
yeah,
and how they now treat their citizens are very crucial because these girls are afraid of having another, they're Muslims, and then in each interview, almost in every focus group, they have been mentioning that they're afraid of being killed because now Germany is too hostile. And then especially last year when I was collecting and finalizing my data, there was the elections, and all the right-wing parties were saying Islam is not part of Germany, all Muslims should go out, and as well as neo-Nazi murders in Germany lately, and last 10 years. So these Muslim girls are afraid of another genocide in Germany. And then I was digging more and talking with the Turkish community. It's like a fear in the community that there's going to be a genocide in Germany again.
Wow.
And the girls were saying, I have my quotes, Germans are not learning from their history. And because, in German lessons, it was very, for me, something really interesting, really shocking, that girls explain their history lessons as their teachers are very happy to discuss about genocide. And then from age of 14 to 21. So when you brought up this issue now, dealing with the trauma, I don't know, it was very significant in my data how these young girls with Muslim origin are bringing this issue of Germanness or being part of the society or how they integrate themselves That's
really interesting. It's really interesting because the young women who are immigrants or who are Muslim, they will probably be most exposed to the right-wing conservative element rather than a middle class where you actually cushion from the extreme elements, right? And so it's amazing how a small minority can actually cause a climate of fear in a community. Because for me, when I go and walk around Berlin and I talk about the Solidaritätstax to people of my age and my generation, they all know about it, they're all in agreement with it because it's changing and it's making their homes safer and whatever. But I suppose if I go and speak to people who live in lower socioeconomic situation, it will be much different, right? There'll be much more polarized views around something as exciting as the Solidaritätstax. So they're voting on it, I think, next year in Germany, whether they're going to continue it, because it's now been 20 years, but it's already doing so much good in terms of bridging the divides and upping levels of education and schooling in the former East Germany and all of that. But that's a great insight.
Yeah. Sure. Well, I've never been to South Africa, but I grew up in a highly segregated American South, and I was in high school when the Supreme Court ruling came through about integrating in school. So I had the experience of being in a white community which was reacting, sort of unbelievably kind of over the top. And, it's interesting because the community I lived in was very blue collar. And, my parents were immigrants and their kids were going to, get to college and move on out. And this happened, but when I look now at my high school, it is now pretty well totally black.
Yeah.
And it's also a failing school. And, that was when I discovered this, I was kind of a shock to my system. Yeah. Because I realized, how these problems, how they sort of feel like there are echoes.
Sure.
That just keep going on and on and on. So, from one situation to the next, that here we have many, many, many problems, I think, that are not as extreme as they were in South Africa, but they're very similar in many ways.
Yeah.
And so, it's kind of taking your analysis and mapping it onto many of our situations here. I wonder, it feels pretty universal.
Well, that's as I was making my litany of poor education, low quality jobs, I'm thinking I could be talking about almost anywhere in the world. The thing that's interesting about the US, of course, is that there's this generational disjunction now. So you've got 40 years between the 60s civil rights movement and what's going on right now. And so it might be quite interesting to see whether the restitution of personhood is still applicable in broken spaces in the US.
Well, there was a very interesting piece today. I don't remember whether it's BUR or the New York Times, saying that states, that individuals from a number of states are now sending messages to the White House saying they want to secede from the Union. They're like 20, it's in today's news. So that sense of division, which is like somewhere there's a wall in the middle, right? You can't get over that wall because mentally, right, that wall is just way too high and inside your own community.
And what are they wanting to secede over?
Yeah, what's the issue?
Is it gay marriage or is it legalization of marijuana? Sorry.
Well, I think these are cultural histories. And on last week, we heard the story about how in Arizona they've been teaching ethnic studies in the schools, and that the powers that be have actually sort of stopped the program and said it's anti-American.
I was going to mention that the teaching about Black consciousness, that it's illegal now in Arizona to teach Latin American studies or to have bilingual schools.
Really?
So
that you're not allowed to teach
divisive.
Right. That in a theory of assimilation and trying to teach white American culture, that these large Latin American cultures are being totally denied as illegitimate and un-American in Arizona schools where they're the majority.
Black consciousness is more radical than just having Latino studies. But that's something in South Africa that I'd like to make sure that every high school kid understands what black consciousness did and didn't do, in the struggle for freedom and democracy. Because almost nobody that I know, young people, my litmus test is my students, right? But they're sociology students, and they're 20 or 22, and they also have no idea of what it was and what it meant, and the continuity with the US civil rights movement and with some of the African decolonization that was happening from Algeria and further down north. No idea of that history. Is it just an issue of youth that young people just don't want to remember or don't want to learn? I don't know. I do get a bit disconcerted by it. Sarah?
I was just going to pick up on this idea of the absence of history or kind of disappearing for a while, and it sounds like
amnesia. It's an amnesia.
Right.
Yeah.
In Germany, also this kind of inability for these young Muslim girls to find space or the paths into the secret one in the late 90s. And in the areas where I work in refugee settings, this is also a real issue. It's sort of like, well, let's not teach any Rwandese history in the refugee camps in Congo because it's just so politicized and dangerous. But I think the reality is that what goes into that empty space can be far more damaging at times because it is then very politicized, very one individual or a few individuals teaching their own kind of version without any discussion and kind of dialogue. And I think that is in many ways what happened in South Africa in the late 90s, that the history disappeared, but it meant that, and this is what I did my master's work on, that in the former white schools that did have resources, they were getting new books and teaching a kind of new version of South African history. In the former white schools that did not have resources, they were using exactly the same textbooks, teaching exactly the same history as under apartheid. Same thing in the former African schools where they had no new textbooks, were teaching the same kind of history. In the former colored schools, what I found was that the teachers were just teaching from their own memory. So they were just teaching through
About their own
testimony, about
political
their own
involvement in the
experiences
UDF
their
and
own
yeah,
work
yeah.
And so much of it, I think, depending on your positionality and what, I mean, I interpreted that a lot as well, is that the colored community around Cape Town didn't feel like the struggle was over. And so they were going to continue to teach a struggle kind of history because that's what their community is experiencing. Whereas the African schools, in the African schools, the teachers felt such hope, like, well, things are going to be different, our schools are going to change, we're just going to go with the flow. And then there was this bifurcation among our whites.
And the figures support it. I mean, the only group of South Africans who are becoming more impoverished are colored people. You know, so I mean, they're a small group, and it's a slight decline, but it supports their view of being left out. So they're not overtly wounded, but they're excluded from, you know, affirmative action, from all sorts of other redressing measures. Yeah.
And I think in many places there's been this attempt to think about what are the places of developing historical narrative, even if it is too hard to do it in a curriculum.
Yeah.
What are the public spaces? What kind of role does reporting play, or film, or television?
So the thing that I'm picking up from our discussion now is that I think a lot of my work needs to be on, I mean, I think memory and dignity, but how? I mean, those are the two big issues. I'm not sure what to do about equality means in citizenship, because it's the kind of stuff that we always talk about when we talk about citizenship. But I think there's I need to start finding new ways of seeing that will appeal to young people, whether that's school or in university. And then the other thing, of course, is what are the spaces? I think that's a really important thing. I've my list where I've got my civic and personal and structural, I've got an exhaustive list, and I've just put up a few pieces here as a means of illustration. But I realize that that's the thing that I want to come out of this international study, is where are these spaces and what are the things? I mean, I think clearly memory and dignity, but what does equality and resources mean, and how do you do it when there's so much inequality in the world? You know, I can't be a socialist even if I wanted to.
Is it time to?
It is a top class.
Well, because Charlene is going off to give another inspirational talk in the public health school. So let her go and recruit her agenda for learning. So thank you very much, Charlene. It's inspirational.
No, thank you for the opportunity.
I'm so glad we recorded it. Many people couldn't come today and watch this. And good luck with developing these exciting ideas.
Thank you.
That's important. Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you all for coming. Do please.
And thanks for your great questions.